Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog had settled upon London with particular malevolence that evening, transforming the familiar streets into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertain shapes. From our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps below appeared as mere smudges of amber light, their feeble glow barely penetrating the thick, grey shroud that had descended upon the city. I had been attempting to read the latest issue of The Lancet when I became aware that my friend Sherlock Holmes had abandoned his chemical experiments and now stood motionless at the window, his angular profile etched against the dim light like a figure carved from stone. "Watson," he said without turning, his voice carrying that peculiar note of suppressed anticipation that I had learned to associate with the arrival of an intriguing case. "Observe the gentleman approaching our door. What do you make of him?" I joined him at the window and peered down through the murky evening air. A figure in a dark overcoat was indeed making his way toward our building, his gait hurried yet unsteady, as though each step required considerable effort of will. Even from our elevated position I could discern the quality of his attire and the obvious distress that marked his every movement. "A man of some means, certainly," I ventured, studying what details I could make out through the fog. "His bearing suggests education and social standing, though he appears to be labouring under considerable emotional strain." Holmes turned from the window with that sardonic smile playing about his thin lips. "Quite so, my dear fellow, though you have barely scratched the surface. Note how he favours his right side, suggesting either a recent injury or a chronic condition that has worsened under stress. Observe also how his hand repeatedly moves to his waistcoat pocket, then away again, as though he carries something of great importance, yet fears to touch it. Most tellingly, see how he pauses every few steps to glance over his shoulder. This is not merely a man in distress, Watson, but one who believes himself to be in genuine danger." Before I could respond, the sharp rap of our door-knocker echoed from below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's measured footsteps upon the stairs. Within moments, our landlady appeared at our threshold, her expression bearing that mixture of curiosity and concern that invariably accompanied the arrival of a particularly agitated client. "Mr. Holmes," she announced, "there's a gentleman to see you, a Dr. Cornelius Whitmore. He seems most urgent in his request, though I must say he appears quite beside himself with worry." Holmes rubbed his hands together with evident satisfaction. "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps you might prepare some brandy. I suspect our visitor will require fortification before his tale is complete." The man who entered our sitting room was indeed a study in barely controlled panic. Dr. Whitmore appeared to be in his middle 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines etched around his eyes that spoke of recent sleepless nights. His clothes, while expensive and well-tailored, bore the telltale signs of hasty dressing, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves and accepted the chair Holmes offered. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with strain, "I come to you because Scotland Yard has proven utterly inadequate to the task, and I fear that without your intervention I shall either lose my sanity or my life. Perhaps both." Holmes settled into his chair with the fluid grace of a cat, his grey eyes fixed intently upon our visitor's face. "Pray compose yourself, Dr. Whitmore, and tell us what has brought you to our door on this fog-shrouded evening. I assure you that Dr. Watson and I have encountered circumstances far stranger than you might imagine." Dr. Whitmore accepted the brandy I offered with gratitude and took a substantial draught before continuing. "4 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, something occurred at my country estate in Surrey that defies all rational explanation. I am a man of science, a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, and I have spent my career studying the natural world through the lens of empirical observation. What I have witnessed, however, challenges everything I believed possible." He paused, staring into the amber depths of his glass as though seeking courage there. "It concerns the ravens, Mr. Holmes, the ancient ravens that have roosted in the great oak behind my manor house for longer than anyone can remember. For 4 consecutive nights, at precisely the stroke of midnight, they have begun to speak." I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily at this extraordinary statement, but Holmes merely leaned forward slightly, his expression one of intense interest rather than skepticism. "Speak, you say? In what manner precisely?" "In clear, articulate English, Mr. Holmes, words that chill my very soul. Each night they cry out in unison, their voices carrying across the grounds like some infernal chorus. And each morning I discover that their pronouncements have proven terrifyingly accurate." The room fell silent, save for the gentle hissing of the gas jets and the distant sounds of evening traffic filtering up from the street below. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture I recognized as indicating his complete absorption in the problem at hand. "And what exactly do these prophetic corvids proclaim?" Dr. Whitmore's face had grown pale, and he gripped his brandy glass with white knuckles. "The first night, they spoke a single name: Margaret Ashford. By dawn, word came that Mrs. Ashford, the vicar's wife, had been found dead in her garden, apparently having suffered a heart attack during her evening constitutional. A tragic coincidence, surely, I interjected, though even as I spoke the words I felt a chill of unease. "That is precisely what I told myself, Doctor," Whitmore replied, his eyes never leaving Holmes's face. But the second night brought another name: Thomas Blackwood, the miller. Before noon the following day, we learned that Blackwood had perished in an accident at his mill, crushed beneath a fallen beam. Holmes rose from his chair and began that familiar pacing that indicated his mind was working at its highest capacity. "Most intriguing. And the subsequent nights?" "The third night they spoke the name Sarah Pemberton, and by morning the young woman had been discovered drowned in the river that runs through the village. Last night, Mr. Holmes, they spoke again, and their words have driven me to seek your assistance with the utmost urgency." Dr. Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They spoke my own name, Mr. Holmes. Cornelius Whitmore echoed across my grounds in those unnatural voices, and I fear that I am marked for death before another sunrise." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air between us. Holmes ceased his pacing and turned to face our client directly, his keen eyes studying every line of the man's terrified features. "Dr. Whitmore, I must ask you to be completely forthright with me. Is there anyone who might wish you harm? Any professional rivalries, personal conflicts, or business dealings that might have created enemies?" "I have lived quietly, Mr. Holmes, dedicating myself to my medical practice and maintaining cordial relations with all my neighbors. I cannot conceive of anyone who would harbor such malice as to orchestrate these elaborate threats against innocent people, much less against myself." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Yet someone clearly possesses both the means and the motivation to stage these remarkable performances. Tell me, during these midnight pronouncements, have you attempted to approach the oak tree or observe the ravens more closely?" Dr. Whitmore shuddered visibly. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, that on each occasion I found myself paralyzed with a terror I cannot adequately describe. The sound of those voices, so utterly unnatural yet unmistakably clear, seemed to rob me of all capacity for rational action." "Perfectly understandable," Holmes replied. "Fear has a way of clouding even the most analytical mind. However, if we are to solve this mystery, we must observe the phenomenon directly. Watson and I shall accompany you to your estate this very evening. If these ravens are to perform again tonight, I intend to be present for their recital. You will come? The relief in Dr. Whitmore's voice was palpable. Indeed. And I assure you, Doctor, that by morning we shall have a far clearer understanding of the forces at work in this most unusual case. As our client departed to make preparations for our arrival, I found myself contemplating the extraordinary tale we had just heard. Holmes, meanwhile, had already begun gathering his magnifying glass, measuring tape, and other tools of investigation, his movements quick and decisive. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "you do not believe that ravens can actually prophesy human deaths?" He paused in his preparations and fixed me with that penetrating stare that never failed to make me feel as though he could read my very thoughts. "My dear Watson, in all our years together, have I ever shown the slightest inclination toward accepting supernatural explanations for seemingly inexplicable events?" "Never," I admitted. "And you may rest assured that these talking ravens, however remarkable their performances may appear, are the product of entirely human machinations. The question is not whether this is an elaborate deception, but rather who has conceived it, how they are executing it, and most importantly, why they have chosen Dr. Whitmore and his neighbours as their targets." The fog seemed to thicken as we prepared to depart for Surrey, and I found myself wondering what revelations the night would bring. Whatever the truth behind the speaking ravens, I was certain that Holmes would pierce through the veil of mystery with his characteristic brilliance, though something in the atmosphere of that November evening suggested we were about to encounter one of the most ingenious deceptions we had yet faced. The journey to Surrey provided Holmes with the opportunity to extract additional details that would prove crucial to our investigation. As our hansom cab wound through the fog-shrouded countryside, he subjected Dr. Whitmore to a gentle but thorough examination regarding his household arrangements and recent events at the estate. "Tell me about your domestic staff," Holmes inquired, his grey eyes never leaving our client's increasingly haggard features. "How long have they served you, and have you noticed any changes in their behaviour since these incidents began?" Dr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably against the leather seat. "I maintain a modest household, Mr. Holmes. There is Mrs. Hartwell, my housekeeper of 15 years, a woman of unquestionable integrity. Jenkins serves as groundskeeper and has been with me for 7 years. Both have shown nothing but loyalty and concern during this terrible ordeal." "And yet," Holmes observed, "someone with intimate knowledge of your estate and its inhabitants has orchestrated these elaborate deceptions. Have there been any recent changes to your household? Any dismissals or departures that might warrant consideration?" The discomfort in Dr. Whitmore's expression deepened considerably. "I confess there was an unpleasant incident approximately 3 weeks ago. I was forced to dismiss Samuel Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell's nephew, whom I had employed as a stable hand. The young man proved unreliable, given to drink and petty theft. When I discovered he had been pilfering items from the house, I terminated his employment immediately." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "And his response to this dismissal?" "Most hostile, I'm afraid. He made threats, claimed I would regret my decision. At the time, I dismissed his words as empty bluster, but given recent circumstances," Dr. Whitmore's voice trailed off meaningfully. "Our destination emerged from the November mist like something from a Gothic romance, its Georgian facade dignified despite the shadows that seemed to cling to every window and doorway. The great oak that housed the prophetic ravens stood perhaps 50 yards behind the main house, its massive trunk and gnarled branches creating a natural amphitheatre in the carefully maintained grounds. Mrs. Hartwell, a woman of middle years whose worried expression spoke volumes about the household's current state, greeted us at the door with obvious relief at her employer's safe return. As she led us through the warmly appointed interior, Holmes immediately requested access to a room providing clear observation of the oak tree. "The ravens have been uncommonly restless this evening, Doctor," she reported anxiously. "Jenkins mentioned they seemed agitated during his afternoon rounds, more so than he's ever witnessed." Holmes accepted this information with a thoughtful nod before excusing himself to conduct a preliminary examination of the grounds. Armed with his magnifying glass and measuring tape, he spent the better part of an hour scrutinizing the area around the ancient oak. I observed him crouching at the tree's base, his sensitive fingers exploring the earth with the delicacy of a musician. "Recent excavation," he murmured, lifting a cleanly cut switch for my inspection. "Small pockets, not trenches, and executed with considerable skill." He directed my attention to a faint gleam on the bark itself. "Observe this substance, Watson. Fresh application, I would venture." From his coat he produced a length of fine black thread, which he strung between two stakes near the oak at knee height. "An elementary precaution," he explained. "Should anyone approach the tree during tonight's performance, we shall know of it immediately." As the grandfather clock in the hall began its resonant chiming of midnight, the fog seemed to thicken around us. We had positioned ourselves at the upstairs window, with Dr. Whitmore trembling beside us despite the warmth of the room. The great oak stood like a sentinel in the mist, its dark inhabitant stirring restlessly among the upper branches. Then it began. Through the dense, swirling fog came voices, not the natural cause of birds, but distinct human words, amplified and distorted, echoing with supernatural resonance from the direction of the ancient tree. "Cornelius Whitmore," they shrieked in unnatural chorus, "your time draws near. The earth awaits your return." The sound was genuinely horrifying, a metallic, disembodied proclamation that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Dr. Whitmore gasped audibly, his face draining of colour, while I felt an involuntary shiver despite my rational skepticism. Holmes, however, remained perfectly composed. He closed his eyes, momentarily tilting his head as though analysing the acoustic properties of the phenomenon. As the eerie pronouncements faded into the night, he opened his eyes with that familiar glint of understanding already present in their depths. "Most illuminating," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass once more. "The earth may indeed await, but it appears to have been rather careless with its secrets tonight." The game, as Holmes would say, was now afoot. The moment the supernatural chorus faded into the November night, Holmes was already moving toward the staircase with that characteristic urgency that marked the beginning of his most intensive investigations. "Come, Watson," he whispered, his grey eyes alight with the thrill of intellectual pursuit. "The performance has concluded, but the true mystery now reveals itself to those who know where to look." We descended through the darkened house with practiced stealth, Dr. Whitmore following behind us with considerably less grace, his recent terror making him clumsy despite his obvious desire to remain close to his protectors. The fog had thickened during the brief supernatural display, transforming the familiar grounds into an alien landscape where even the most mundane features seemed to shift and blur with each cautious step. Holmes made directly for the great oak, his dark lantern casting a narrow beam that pierced the murky air like a golden sword. As we approached the ancient tree, I could observe the ravens settling back into their roosts with what appeared to be unusual agitation, their dark forms rustling and cawing with distinctly natural sounds that contrasted sharply with the otherworldly voices we had just witnessed. "First, the fundamentals," Holmes murmured, directing his light toward the delicate thread he had strung between the stakes earlier that evening. The black strand remained perfectly taut, undisturbed by any passage. Excellent. No one approached the tree during the performance, which eliminates the possibility of a confederate concealed among the branches or at the base of the trunk. He knelt beside the massive oak, his magnifying glass catching the lantern light as he examined the bark with microscopic attention. The substance he had noted earlier proved even more interesting under close scrutiny. Holmes scraped a small sample into his handkerchief, holding it close to his nose with the delicate appreciation of a connoisseur. "Observe, Watson," he said, directing my attention to a faint, metallic gleam worked into the natural fissures of the bark. A resinous compound recently applied with properties that suggest a very specific acoustic purpose. Note how it has been carefully worked into the natural cavities of the trunk, creating what I believe to be a primitive but effective sound conductor. Dr. Whitmore hovered anxiously behind us, his breath forming visible clouds in the chill night air. "Mr. Holmes, surely we should not linger here. If those creatures truly possess supernatural powers, might we not be placing ourselves in considerable danger?" Holmes rose from his examination with that sardonic smile playing about his lips. "I assure you, Doctor, the only supernatural element in tonight's display was the remarkable ingenuity of its human architect. However, you raise an excellent point about danger, though not from any otherworldly source." His lantern beam swept in a wide arc around the oak's perimeter, revealing the pattern of small excavations he had discovered during his earlier reconnaissance. Each cavity appeared to have been carefully dug and then partially concealed, though Holmes's trained eye detected the subtle variations in soil color and texture that betrayed their presence. "Most ingenious," he observed with genuine admiration. "Our unknown adversary has created an acoustic amplification system of considerable sophistication. These excavations serve as resonating chambers, while the metallic compound on the bark conducts sound with remarkable efficiency." At this moment, Jenkins appeared from the direction of the house, his weathered face creased with worry and a stable lantern clutched in his gnarled hands. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but Mrs. Hartwell sent me to see if you required assistance." That sound, it fair turned my blood to ice. It did. Holmes fixed the groundskeeper with his penetrating stare. "How long have you been in Dr. Whitmore's employ, Jenkins?" 7 years come Michaelmas, sir. Never seen nor heard the like of this in all that time." "And you remained in your cottage throughout the evening?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably under Holmes's scrutiny. "Aye, sir, though I confess I stepped out briefly when I heard voices from the direction of the village road. Thought it might be poachers, but saw nothing in this cursed fog." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me before continuing his questioning. "Tell me about Samuel Hartwell, the dismissed stable hand. When did you last see him?" The groundskeeper's expression darkened considerably. 3 days past, sir, outside the King's Head in the village. He saw me and slunk away quick as you please, but not before I caught sight of his condition. Looked rough, he did, and there was something in his manner that didn't sit right. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned he had gone to London. That's what she believes, sir, and I hadn't the heart to tell her different. The lad's her sister's boy, and she's always had a soft spot for him despite his failings. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "One final question, Jenkins. Dr. Whitmore mentioned that the previous victims all had connections to parish charity work. Can you elaborate on these arrangements?" Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his voice gaining strength as he moved away from supernatural fears toward more mundane concerns. "I serve as treasurer for the Parish Relief Fund, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Ashford assisted with the accounts Thomas Blackwood held the lease on mill rights that cross our charity lands, and poor Sarah Pemberton was companion to Miss Lydia Vale, our most generous benefactor. And Samuel Hartwell would have been familiar with these arrangements? Certainly. He often ran errands between the various properties and would have overheard countless discussions about parish business. Holmes began pacing around the oak tree with renewed energy, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications of this information. The pattern becomes clearer, gentlemen. We are dealing with someone who possesses intimate knowledge of both the estate and the parish charitable arrangements, someone with both motive for revenge and the technical skill to execute this elaborate deception. As if summoned by his words, a faint sound drifted through the fog from the direction of the village road, the unmistakable whisper of bicycle wheels upon gravel. Holmes extinguished his lantern immediately, and we stood in the cold darkness, listening intently as the sound faded into the distance. "An hour too late for that particular interview," Holmes murmured. "But the morning will bring its own revelations, and I suspect our mysterious cyclist will prove most illuminating when we finally make his acquaintance." The faint echo of bicycle wheels retreating into the fog had scarcely faded when Holmes was already striding back toward the great oak with renewed purpose. The supernatural performance had concluded, but I could see in his alert expression that the true investigation was only beginning. As we approached the ancient tree once more, he directed his lantern beam toward the base of the massive trunk, his keen eyes searching for details that others would certainly overlook. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, kneeling beside one of the small excavations he had noted earlier. With delicate precision, he lifted what appeared to be a carefully concealed plug of earth and moss, revealing beneath it a clay aperture no larger than a teacup. The mouth of our oracle, cunningly disguised and positioned with considerable skill. He produced his magnifying glass and examined the rim of the opening, which bore traces of the same resinous compound we had observed on the bark. "A speaking tube system of remarkable sophistication," he continued, his voice filled with professional admiration. "These clay pipes branch beneath the ground like the roots of the tree itself, their outlets strategically placed to create the illusion of multiple voices emanating from the branches above." Dr. Whitmore watched with fascination and growing relief as Holmes methodically exposed the mechanical nature of the supernatural phenomenon. But surely such an elaborate construction would require considerable technical knowledge? "Precisely the question that troubles me," Holmes replied, carefully replacing the concealed aperture. "A dismissed stable hand, however vindictive, would hardly possess the engineering expertise necessary for such an undertaking. We are dealing with a conspiracy, gentlemen, one that involves at least two individuals with complementary skills." We returned to the warmth of the manor house, where Holmes immediately requested access to Dr. Whitmore's study and the parish relief fund records. As our client arranged the leather-bound ledgers upon his desk, I noticed Mrs. Hartwell hovering anxiously in the doorway, her weathered face creased with worry that seemed to extend beyond concern for her employer's supernatural predicament. Holmes settled himself before the financial records with the concentrated attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. For nearly an hour he turned pages with surgical precision, his grey eyes scanning columns of figures and correspondence with increasing interest. Finally, he looked up with that expression of grim satisfaction that invariably accompanied a significant discovery. "Most illuminating, Doctor," he announced, indicating a series of entries from the previous months. "Your bookkeeping is exemplary, but observe these subtle discrepancies in the running totals. Small amounts carefully distributed across multiple transactions, but forming a pattern that suggests systematic embezzlement over an extended period." Dr. Whitmore's face grew pale as he examined the evidence Holmes indicated. Samuel had access to these records during his employment. He often carried messages between the various fund recipients and would have observed the actual amounts being distributed. Exactly, and when you discovered his petty thefts and dismissed him, he realized that a thorough audit of the fund's accounts was inevitable. The missing money would be discovered, his reputation destroyed, and criminal charges would certainly follow. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. Consider the elegance of his solution. Rather than fleeing immediately, he conceived a plan to eliminate the very witnesses who could testify to the discrepancies. At this moment, Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Forgive me, gentlemen, but I couldn't help overhearing. You speak of my nephew Samuel as though he were capable of murder. Surely there must be some mistake." Holmes fixed her with his penetrating stare, though his voice remained gentle. "Tell me, Mrs. Hartwell, during Samuel's employment here, did he form any particular friendships in the village? Anyone who might have shared his interests or possessed technical knowledge?" The poor woman considered this carefully, her maternal concern for her wayward nephew evident in every line of her face. "There was young James Pemberton, Sarah's brother. He works at the railway engineering works in London and has always been clever with machinery. Samuel spent considerable time in his company during the summer months, though I confess I never understood their conversations about pipes and pressures and such mechanical matters." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, and I could see the satisfaction of confirmed theory in his expression. James Pemberton, the railway engineer. A man with both the technical expertise to construct our acoustic apparatus and, following his sister's tragic death, a powerful motive for revenge. "But surely," Dr. Whitmore protested, "you cannot suggest that young Pemberton would participate in his own sister's murder." "On the contrary," Holmes replied gravely, "I suspect Sarah Pemberton's death was entirely unplanned, though perhaps hastened by her discovery of the conspiracy. When the ravens pronounced her name, she may have realized the terrible truth about the supernatural pronouncements and confronted her brother with her knowledge. A moment of panic, a struggle near the river, and the scheme suddenly acquired an additional victim." The room fell silent as the full horror of Holmes's theories settled upon us. Outside, the November wind had risen, sending the fog swirling in ghostly patterns across the grounds, where the great oak stood sentinel over its burden of genuine ravens, now silent and still in the growing dawn. "If your analysis is correct," I said finally, "then both Samuel Hartwell and James Pemberton remain at large, and Dr. Whitmore remains in genuine danger." Holmes nodded grimly, moving to the window where the first pale rays of morning were beginning to penetrate the dissipating fog. "Indeed, Watson, the supernatural threats have served their purpose admirably, but our adversaries now face a crucial decision. They can abandon their scheme and flee, accepting partial success, or they can attempt to complete their original plan by eliminating the final witness to their embezzlement." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of the village church bell drifted through the morning air, marking another hour's passage toward full daylight. Holmes remained at the window, his silhouette dark against the pale sky, his keen mind undoubtedly calculating the next moves in this deadly game of deception. "I rather suspect," he said quietly, his voice carrying that note of anticipation that marked the approach of a case's climax, "that we shall have our answer before another night falls upon Surrey." The pale light of dawn revealed a countryside transformed, the fog lifting to expose a landscape beaded with cold dew, and marked by the subtle traces that only Holmes's trained eye could detect. He had risen before sunrise, and I found him already dressed and examining the gravel drive with his magnifying glass, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating faint impressions in the softer earth beside the carriageway. "Our nocturnal cyclist left more evidence than he intended." He traced the narrow track of bicycle wheels that emerged from the village direction, noting where they had paused near the estate's boundary hedge. With delicate precision, he lifted an ash twig from the nearby ditch and examined the translucent film that coated its tip. "Glycerin and pine tar," he announced after touching the substance to his tongue with clinical detachment. "A waterproofing compound commonly used in railway and telegraph work. Our engineer has indeed left his signature." Following the track's path, Holmes discovered where the hedgerow had been carefully disturbed, revealing the clay apertures of the underground speaking tube system. Each opening had been glazed with the same resinous compound, creating an acoustic network of remarkable sophistication that connected the roadside position to the great oak. We were still examining these ingenious conduits when the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard. The inspector's weathered face bore its characteristic expression of professional skepticism as he dismounted, his practical nature clearly struggling with the supernatural elements of Dr. Whitmore's original telegram. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced, removing his bowler hat. "I confess myself at a complete loss. Talking ravens and prophetic murders. Surely we're not dealing with genuine supernatural phenomena?" Holmes greeted the inspector with uncharacteristic warmth, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate the mechanical nature of the deception. As he outlined our discoveries, I observed Lestrade's expression gradually shift from skepticism to professional interest, his years of experience teaching him to recognize the patterns of human greed beneath even the most elaborate theatrical displays. "So you believe this dismissed stable hand has an accomplice with technical knowledge?" Lestrade inquired, producing his notebook with practiced efficiency. "Precisely, and I suspect we shall find evidence of their collaboration if we examine Samuel Hartwell's former workspace." Holmes led us toward the estate's outbuildings, where a thorough search of the disused potting shed revealed a cache of materials hidden beneath old burlap sacks. Copper wire, lead weights, and a coil of gut string similar to that used on musical instruments lay alongside a crude, hand-drawn sketch depicting interconnected tubes and a rudimentary bellows system. "Amateur engineering," Holmes observed, studying the diagram, "but sufficient for our purposes. This confirms the involvement of James Pemberton, whose railway experience provided the technical expertise Samuel lacked." Lestrade examined the evidence with growing interest, though his practical nature led him to dismiss the more subtle clues. "Clear enough motive and means," he declared. "I'll have my men pick up this Hartwell fellow immediately." At this moment, Mrs. Hartwell appeared at the shed door, her face pale with distress as she clutched a piece of paper. "Dr. Whitmore, forgive the interruption, but this threatening message was just delivered by a village boy." Holmes immediately examined the communication, which read, "The ravens have spoken truly. Join your fellow sinners before sunset, or face consequences beyond your darkest fears." While the handwriting attempted disguise, Holmes noted with satisfaction the watermark visible when held to the light. "Pemberton Mills, Manchester," he announced. "Our correspondent's choice of stationery proves most revealing. The conspiracy grows desperate, which makes them increasingly dangerous but also more likely to make crucial mistakes." The discovery of a faint circular impression in the shed's dusty floor, marked with traces of metallic dust, suggested the recent presence of a heavy cylindrical device. Holmes examined this evidence with intense concentration, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. Our adversaries have been more active than we initially suspected, he murmured. This impression suggests they've been testing their apparatus, refining their methods. The danger to Dr. Whitmore has not diminished with daylight. As the morning progressed, Holmes formulated a strategy that would draw the conspirators into the open. This evening, Doctor, you will appear to succumb to their psychological pressure. Make a great show of fleeing in panic toward London, while Lestrade positions his men for the true confrontation. The trap was set, and as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, I could see in Holmes's grey eyes the familiar glint of anticipation that marked the approach of a case's climax. The afternoon shadows stretched long and ominous across the Surrey countryside as Holmes orchestrated his elaborate trap with the methodical precision of a master tactician. Dr. Whitmore, despite his genuine terror of the previous evening's supernatural display, proved himself an admirable actor as he made a conspicuous show of packing his belongings in apparent panic, loudly declaring to Mrs. Hartwell his urgent need to flee to London before another midnight could bring fresh horrors. Holmes had spent the morning hours preparing his most ingenious countermeasures. At each of the concealed clay apertures he had discovered, he applied a thin dusting of French chalk mixed with a distinctive violet dye that would stain any hand that touched the treated surfaces. Along the hedgerow approach, he strung nearly invisible threads at various heights, creating an early warning system that would alert him to any movement through the fog. Most cleverly, he had inserted a small tin whistle into one of the speaking tube conduits, its mouthpiece positioned where he could manipulate it from concealment to distort any attempted supernatural performance. "They must believe you have broken under the psychological pressure," Holmes explained to Dr. Whitmore as the carriage was brought around. "Your apparent flight will force them to accelerate their timeline, compelling them to act while their preparations remain incomplete." Lestrade had positioned his constables with characteristic efficiency throughout the grounds, though Holmes insisted they remain completely concealed until the moment of action. The inspector himself took station in the abandoned potting shed, while his men established observation posts in the surrounding hedgerows with clear lines of sight to both the Great Oak and the village road approaches. As Dr. Whitmore's carriage departed with theatrical urgency, Holmes and I established ourselves at the upper window of the manor house, armed with his powerful telescope to monitor the entire estate. The deception required our client to return secretly on foot through the fields after his visible departure, rejoining us well before the conspirators would dare to approach. "They will wait until full darkness," Holmes predicted, adjusting the telescope's focus as twilight gathered. The psychological effect of their supernatural performance requires proper atmospheric conditions, and they cannot risk detection during their preparatory work. The November evening brought with it a light fog, though nothing approaching the supernatural thickness of the previous night. Holmes observed the weather conditions with evident satisfaction, recognizing that the partial obscurity would serve our purposes rather than theirs. At precisely 9:30, Holmes detected the first signs of a movement along the village road. Through the telescope, he observed two figures approaching on foot, wheeling their bicycles rather than riding them, their cautious advance betraying acute awareness of the risks involved in their enterprise. "Samuel Hartwell and James Pemberton," Holmes murmured, passing the instrument to me. "Observe how Pemberton carries that canvas-wrapped cylinder strapped to his bicycle frame. Our railway engineer has brought mechanical reinforcement for tonight's performance." The conspirators approached the estate boundary with extraordinary caution, pausing frequently to listen for any sign of human presence. When they reached the hedgerow where the speaking tube system originated, Pemberton began assembling what appeared to be a portable bellows mechanism, while Hartwell maintained nervous watch along the road. Holmes had anticipated this development with remarkable accuracy. "The previous performances relied upon natural acoustics," he whispered, "but tonight they require greater amplification to maintain their deception. That mechanical device will force air through their underground tube system with considerably more power. Dr. Whitmore, who had successfully completed his clandestine return, crouched beside us with barely controlled anxiety as he watched the two figures preparing their elaborate apparatus. The mechanical preparations consumed nearly half an hour, during which Holmes maintained constant observation while periodically signaling to Lestrade's concealed positions. At 10 minutes before midnight, the conspirators activated their improved system. The familiar supernatural voices began echoing across the grounds, but with a distinctly mechanical quality that betrayed their artificial origin to anyone listening with educated attention. "Cornelius Whitmore," the amplified chorus proclaimed, "your final hour approaches. Join your fellow sinners in the earth." Holmes, however, was no longer watching the great oak where the voices seemed to originate. His attention remained fixed upon the hedgerow, where James Pemberton knelt beside his bellows apparatus, his right hand pressed firmly against the treated clay aperture as he forced air through the system. Even in the dim light, the violet stain was clearly visible on his palm when he lifted it. "Perfect!" Holmes breathed with satisfaction. "Our engineer has marked himself as surely as if he had signed a confession." Meanwhile, Samuel Hartwell had separated from his companion and was moving stealthily toward the manor house itself, clearly intending to enter the building while the household presumably cowered before the supernatural performance. Holmes had anticipated this tactic as well, and as Hartwell approached the study window, he found himself confronted not by a terrified household, but by Inspector Lestrade and two sturdy constables. The capture unfolded with swift efficiency. Lestrade's men emerged from concealment on all sides, their coordinated movement preventing any possibility of escape. "Stop! In the Queen's name!" The inspector's commanding voice shattered the night air, bringing both the supernatural performance and the criminal enterprise to an abrupt conclusion. Samuel Hartwell, caught in the act of attempting to force entry through the study window, surrendered immediately with a cry of despair. James Pemberton, his hand still stained with the telltale violet dye, made a desperate attempt to flee on his bicycle, but found his escape route blocked by Jenkins, who had closed the side gate at Holmes's prearranged signal. Within minutes, both conspirators were secured in handcuffs, their elaborate deception exposed, and their criminal conspiracy brought to its inevitable conclusion. The mechanical bellows apparatus lay abandoned beside the hedgerow, its canvas wrapping fallen away to reveal the ingenious but ultimately futile device that had given voice to the speaking ravens. Holmes descended from our observation post with evident satisfaction, his grey eyes bright with the intellectual pleasure of a puzzle successfully solved. As he examined the captured apparatus and the violet-stained evidence on Pemberton's hand, I could see him already formulating the complete explanation that would soon illuminate every aspect of this remarkable case. "The supernatural has once again yielded to the scientific method," he observed, with characteristic understatement, "though I suspect our prisoners will have much to explain before this matter reaches its final resolution." The captured conspirators presented a study in contrasts as they were brought under guard into Dr. Whitmore's study, their elaborate deception now reduced to scattered mechanical debris across the estate grounds. Samuel Hartwell maintained sullen defiance despite his obvious terror, while James Pemberton's engineer's precision had given way to barely controlled desperation as the full implications of his situation became clear. Holmes approached the interrogation with characteristic psychological insight, recognizing that Pemberton's technical pride would prove more revealing than direct confrontation. "Ingenious workmanship," he observed, examining the portable bellows apparatus with genuine professional interest. The acoustic calculations alone must have required considerable mathematical expertise. "Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, how did you achieve such precise resonance through clay conduits of varying diameter? The flattery had its intended effect. Despite his desperate circumstances, Pemberton found himself unable to resist explaining the technical challenges he had overcome. The resonance chambers required exact proportions, he began, his voice gaining strength as professional vanity overcame caution. Each aperture had to be calibrated according to distance from the source, with adjustments for atmospheric pressure and humidity variations. And the glycerin compound on the aperture rims? Holmes continued smoothly. Waterproofing, naturally, but also acoustic enhancement. The resinous qualities amplify certain frequencies while dampening others, creating the otherworldly effect. Pemberton's technical pride had completely overcome his legal peril. Samuel could never have conceived such a system. His role was purely observational, identifying the victims and their schedules. Lestrade exchanged a meaningful glance with Holmes, recognizing that vanity was providing a confession more complete than any legal pressure could achieve. However, when the inspector pressed for details about the actual deaths, both men became evasive, their earlier cooperation dissolving into nervous silence. "We gave voices to the ravens," Hartwell finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "Nothing more than that. If people died from fright, that's hardly our fault." Holmes studied both men with that penetrating stare that seemed to read their very souls. "Yet you chose your victims with remarkable precision. Mrs. Ashford, with her weak heart, Thomas Blackwood, working alone at dangerous machinery. Curious how your supernatural pronouncements aligned so perfectly with their vulnerabilities." At this moment, Mrs. Hartwell appeared at the study door, her weathered face creased with worry as she carried a tray bearing brandy and glasses. "I thought the gentleman might require some fortification after such a terrible ordeal," she murmured, setting the service upon the sideboard with trembling hands. Dr. Whitmore reached gratefully toward the decanter, but Holmes's hand, light as a bird's wing, settled upon his wrist and prevented the motion. "One moment, Doctor," he said quietly, bending over the rim of the crystal vessel. He inhaled delicately, then held the decanter to the lamplight, revealing a faint opalescent quality in the amber liquid. "You have been most thoughtful, Mrs. Hartwell," Holmes continued in that same measured tone, "though perhaps overly generous in your preparations." He touched a single drop to his glove and brought it to his nose. Prussic acid leaves little mercy and less time for its victims. Fortunately, excessive caution can save a man from misplaced trust. The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Hartwell stared in mute horror, her hands fluttering helplessly at her apron as though seeking refuge in familiar domestic routines. "I have done no murder," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Samuel is foolish, but he is not wicked. I only sought to spare him further questioning." "Your loyalty is commendable," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic gentleness, "but it has been exploited by someone who counts upon such devotion. Inspector, I suggest Mrs. Hartwell be taken into protective custody immediately. The prussic acid could only have been introduced within the last hour, and by someone with intimate knowledge of household routines." As Lestrade moved to secure both the evidence and the distraught housekeeper, Holmes turned back to the prisoners with renewed intensity. "Gentlemen, it appears your conspiracy extends beyond mechanical ravens and acoustic deceptions. Someone has been directing your activities with considerable sophistication, someone who anticipated our investigation and prepared contingencies accordingly." Pemberton's face had grown ashen as the implications became clear. "We received our instructions," he admitted reluctantly. "Notes left in specific locations, never the same twice, always with precise timing and detailed requirements." "And the source of these communications?" unknown to us. We assumed it was Samuel's idea initially, but the technical specifications, the timing, the selection of victims— Pemberton's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. Someone else has been orchestrating everything. Holmes nodded grimly, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight like polished steel. Indeed, and that someone has just attempted to silence Dr. Whitmore permanently, suggesting our investigation has approached dangerously close to the truth. At that moment, a sharp knock echoed through the study. Jenkins appeared at the threshold, his weathered face grave with concern. "Forgive the intrusion, sir, but there's been an urgent message from the village. Miss Lydia Vale's housekeeper has sent word that her mistress has taken suddenly ill and requests Dr. Whitmore's immediate attendance." Holmes and I exchanged a meaningful glance, both recognizing the suspicious timing of this development. "Miss Vale, the parish's most generous benefactor," Holmes murmured thoughtfully. "How convenient that she should require medical attention precisely when our investigation threatens to expose the true architect of this conspiracy." Dr. Whitmore, still shaken by his narrow escape from poisoning, looked uncertainly between Holmes and the message. "Surely I cannot ignore a medical emergency regardless of the circumstances." "On the contrary, Doctor," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of anticipation that marked the approach of a case's climax. "I believe we shall all pay Miss Vale a visit this evening. If our unseen director seeks to change the venue of this deadly game, we must be prepared to meet them on whatever stage they have chosen." The fog was beginning to lift as we prepared for what promised to be the final act of this elaborate drama, though I suspected the most dangerous revelations still lay ahead in the darkness beyond Dr. Whitmore's estate. The journey to Miss Lydia Vale's residence through the clearing November fog provided Holmes with additional time to contemplate the intricate web of deception that was steadily revealing itself. As our carriage wound through the countryside, he maintained that characteristic silence that indicated his analytical mind was working through the implications of each newly discovered connection, his grey eyes fixed upon the distant glow of windows that marked our destination. Dr. Whitmore, still visibly shaken by his narrow escape from poisoning, struggled to maintain his professional composure as we approached what might prove to be another carefully orchestrated trap. "Holmes," he said quietly, "surely we cannot ignore a genuine medical emergency regardless of our suspicions about its timing." "Indeed not, Doctor," Holmes replied, though his tone carried that note of cautious anticipation that I had learned to associate with his most dangerous investigations. However, we must remain alert to the possibility that this medical crisis, like the supernatural ravens, may prove to be another carefully staged performance designed to serve our adversaries' purposes. Miss Vale's Georgian manor house stood in elegant isolation among carefully maintained grounds, its classical proportions speaking of generations of accumulated wealth and refined taste. Yet as our carriage approached the circular drive, Holmes noted with characteristic attention to detail that the household's response to a medical emergency seemed oddly restrained, lacking the urgent activity one might expect when the mistress lay gravely ill. The front door opened before we could announce ourselves, revealing a tall, angular woman in housekeeper's attire whose composed demeanor seemed inappropriate for a household experiencing genuine crisis. "Dr. Whitmore," she announced with formal precision, "Miss Vale has been asking for you most urgently. I am Mrs. Blackwood, recently entered into Miss Vale's service." Holmes studied the woman's face with that penetrating intensity that missed no detail of expression or gesture. "Mrs. Blackwood," he repeated thoughtfully. "Thomas Blackwood's widow, I presume? How remarkably convenient that Miss Vale could provide employment so quickly after your recent bereavement." A fleeting shadow crossed her features before she resumed her composed mask. "Miss Vale has always been most charitable toward those in distress, sir. She offered me the position merely 3 days past, when the miller's accident left me without means of support." As we followed Mrs. Blackwood through the elegantly appointed hallway, Holmes observed with characteristic attention the subtle signs that suggested recent changes in the household routine. Fresh scratches around the lock of what appeared to be a study door, the faint scent of burned paper lingering in the air, and most tellingly, the presence of correspondence scattered upon a side table bearing the distinctive watermark he had noted in previous evidence. The morning room, despite its name, felt oppressive in the lamplight, its heavy draperies drawn tight against the night air. Miss Lydia Vale reclined upon a chaise longue, her pale features suggesting genuine distress, though her alert eyes tracked our movements with keen intelligence that seemed inconsistent with serious medical crisis. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying only the faintest tremor of weakness, "how good of you to come, despite the terrible events at your estate. I fear the shocking news about poor Mrs. Hartwell and her nephew's criminal activities has affected me most severely." Dr. Whitmore approached his patient with professional concern, beginning his examination with practiced efficiency, while Holmes positioned himself where he could observe both Miss Vale and Mrs. Blackwood simultaneously. His analytical mind was clearly working through the implications of the scene before us, noting details that others would certainly overlook. "The emotional strain has indeed been considerable," Miss Vale continued, though I noticed her eyes remained fixed upon Holmes rather than her attending physician. "To discover that trusted members of our parish community could engage in such elaborate deceptions and criminal conspiracy has shaken my faith in human nature." Holmes moved closer to the fireplace, where the remnants of recently burned papers lay among the ashes. With delicate precision, he retrieved several partially consumed fragments, holding them to the lamplight to examine their contents. "How thoughtful of you to maintain such extensive correspondence with your various charitable recipients," he observed conversationally, "though I notice these particular communications bear the watermark of Pemberton Mills, Manchester." The effect of this observation was immediate and telling. Miss Vale's composed facade wavered slightly while Mrs. Blackwood took an involuntary step toward the door before checking herself with visible effort. Dr. Whitmore looked up from his examination with growing confusion as the medical emergency began to transform into something far more sinister. "Most illuminating," Holmes continued, examining additional fragments with his magnifying glass. "Detailed instructions regarding acoustic measurements, precise timing schedules, and what appears to be victim selection criteria, all written in a feminine hand that bears remarkable similarity to the parish relief fund correspondence I examined this morning." Miss Vale attempted to rise from the chaise longue, but her apparent weakness proved genuine as she sank back with obvious distress. "Mr. Holmes, surely you cannot suggest that I, a woman who has devoted her life to charitable works, could be involved in such terrible crimes." "On the contrary, Miss Vale," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that cold precision that marked his most damning accusations. "I suggest that your position as the parish's most generous benefactor provided the perfect cover for a systematic campaign to reduce the financial demands upon your charity through the permanent elimination of your most persistent supplicants." Mrs. Blackwood had moved closer to a writing desk where, I now observed, her hand rested near what appeared to be a small revolver. Holmes naturally had noted this development as well, though he maintained his conversational tone while gradually positioning himself between the weapon and Dr. Whitmore. At this moment the sound of the front door closing echoed through the house with unusual force, followed by the distinctive click of a locking mechanism. The morning room fell silent except for the gentle hissing of the gas jets and the sudden realization that our escape route had been deliberately sealed. Unfortunately, Holmes added with that characteristic note of finality, his grey eyes now fixed upon both women with unwavering intensity, even the most elaborate deceptions eventually encounter the inconvenient persistence of facts, and I fear the time for pretense has now passed entirely. The trap had been sprung, though whether we were the hunters or the hunted remained to be determined in the dangerous moments that lay ahead. The sound of the front door's decisive locking mechanism echoed through the morning room like the closing of a tomb, transforming the elegant space into something far more sinister. Miss Vale abandoned her performance of weakness entirely, rising from the chaise longue with fluid grace that revealed her supposed medical crisis as yet another carefully orchestrated deception. Mrs. Blackwood moved with practiced efficiency toward the writing desk, her weathered hand settling upon the small revolver with the familiarity of previous preparation. Holmes maintained his position near the fireplace, though I observed his fingers had moved closer to the heavy brass poker that rested beside the grate. His grey eyes swept between the two women with that analytical intensity that missed no detail of expression or motivation, already calculating the dynamics of this deadly confrontation. The time for theatrical performances has indeed concluded, Holmes observed, his voice carrying that cold precision that marked his most damning accusations. Miss Vale, your portrayal of the charitable benefactor has been masterful, though I suspect the financial realities behind your generosity tell a rather different story. Miss Vale's cultured voice now carried an edge of steel that transformed her from benevolent patron into something far more dangerous. You have been remarkably persistent, Mr. Holmes, though I confess myself impressed by your thoroughness. Few men would perceive the connections between charitable obligations and practical financial necessities. Dr. Whitmore stared between them with growing horror as the implications became clear. Lydia, surely you cannot mean that you orchestrated those deaths merely to reduce your charitable expenses? Holmes moved closer to the fireplace, where the fragments of burned correspondence lay scattered among the ashes. With delicate precision, he lifted several partially consumed pieces, holding them to the lamplight to examine their watermarks and handwriting characteristics. The pattern becomes evident when one examines the financial records with proper attention, he continued methodically. Your charitable fund was consuming resources far more rapidly than your investments could sustain. The recent agricultural depression had reduced your rental income substantially, while the demands upon your purse grew ever more insistent. Your solution demonstrated remarkable audacity, if deplorable morality. He indicated the burned fragments with clinical detachment. These communications, written in your distinctive hand, provided precise instructions to Samuel Hartwell and James Pemberton. You exploited Hartwell's resentment against Dr. Whitmore, offering him both revenge and financial compensation. Pemberton's engineering expertise made the supernatural deception possible, though I suspect he believed himself to be participating in an elaborate prank rather than systematic murder. Mrs. Blackwood's grip tightened on the revolver, though her weathered features showed the strain of maintaining her resolve. Miss Vale offered me security when Thomas died, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated grief and desperation. She showed me how his death could serve a greater purpose than mere accident. Holmes nodded with grim understanding. Indeed, Thomas Blackwood's death eliminated both a persistent supplicant and provided you with a devoted accomplice. Mrs. Ashford, with her weak heart, succumbed to the psychological pressure of the supernatural pronouncements. Each death was carefully calculated to appear either natural or accidental, while simultaneously reducing the financial burden upon Miss Vale's resources. The full scope of the conspiracy was now revealed in all its calculated cruelty. Miss Vale had systematically identified the most vulnerable recipients of parish charity studied their habits and weaknesses, then orchestrated their elimination through a combination of psychological terror and direct intervention. Sarah Pemberton's death presented an unfortunate complication, Holmes continued, his analytical mind working through each element of the scheme. Her romantic attachment to Samuel Hartwell made her suspicious of his sudden secretiveness and apparent wealth. When she discovered correspondence between yourself and her brother regarding the mechanical apparatus, she confronted James with her knowledge. His panicked response near the river eliminated another witness, though it also intensified his commitment to your cause through manufactured grief. Miss Vale moved toward the heavy draperies that concealed the room's windows, her elegant fingers toying with the control cords. You understand the situation perfectly, Mr. Holmes. Unfortunately, your understanding has made you extraordinarily dangerous to my continued security. At this moment, the sharp sound of fists striking the front door echoed through the house, followed by Inspector Lestrade's commanding voice. "Open in the Queen's name, Scotland Yard." Holmes smiled with evident satisfaction. I took the liberty of arranging a signal with the inspector before our departure. A simple whistle call would summon assistance should the situation prove as dangerous as I suspected. Miss Vale's composed facade finally cracked as the reality of capture became inescapable. "Years of careful planning," she hissed, her refined features contorting with venom, "destroyed by your insufferable meddling." Mrs. Blackwood seemed to sag with something approaching relief, the terrible burden of complicity momentarily lifted by the arrival of the law. The sound of splintering wood announced Lestrade's characteristic solution to locked doors, and within moments the morning room filled with constables whose presence brought the conspiracy of the Speaking Ravens to its inevitable conclusion. As the two women were secured with professional efficiency, Holmes examined the remaining evidence with characteristic thoroughness. The supernatural had once again yielded to systematic investigation, though the human capacity for calculated cruelty had proven as remarkable as ever. The ravens themselves, perched silently in their ancient oak, had returned to their natural voices, their brief career as instruments of murder finally ended. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, watching as Miss Vale was led away in handcuffs, her charitable reputation forever destroyed by the revelation of her true nature. Though I suspect the full documentation of this conspiracy will require considerable time to complete. The morning room, so recently the scene of deadly confrontation, now seemed merely elegant and ordinary, its sinister atmosphere dispelled by the presence of justice and the cold light of truth. The systematic dismantling of Miss Vale's elaborate conspiracy proceeded with the methodical precision that marked Holmes's most thorough investigations. As Inspector Lestrade's constables secured the prisoners, Holmes immediately directed attention toward the wealth of documentary evidence that the morning room contained, his keen eyes already cataloguing each item that would ensure justice prevailed with mathematical certainty. From Miss Vale's writing desk, Holmes extracted a dispatch box bearing her personal seal, its contents revealing the full scope of her calculated malevolence. Correspondence bearing the distinctive Manchester watermark lay scattered within, each document demonstrating the systematic nature of victim selection and the precise timing of supernatural performances. A small stamp press and stick of sealing wax, matching perfectly the impressions found on previous threatening communications, provided irrefutable proof of the conspiracy's authorship. "Most illuminating," Holmes observed, lifting a glazed shard of clay from beneath the fireplace ashes. The curved fragment bore traces of the same resinous compound we had discovered on the speaking tube apertures, its acoustic properties now serving as evidence rather than instruments of terror. From a concealed drawer he produced a vial labelled as laudanum, though the distinctive almond scent revealed its true contents as prussic acid, the same poison that had nearly claimed Dr. Whitmore's life through Mrs. Hartwell's unwitting assistance. Dr. Whitmore stood beside the fireplace in stunned silence, his professional composure gradually returning as the immediate danger receded, though the full implications of his narrow escape from both supernatural terror and calculated murder weighed heavily upon his features. The revelation that his revered benefactor had orchestrated not merely financial deception, but systematic elimination of charitable recipients struck him with devastating force. Inspector Lestrade supervised the documentation process with characteristic efficiency, though his weathered features showed the strain of processing a case that had begun with prophetic ravens and concluded with murder disguised as philanthropy. "Most remarkable investigation, Mr. Holmes," he admitted, securing the last of the evidence in his leather satchel. "Though I confess the mechanical aspects of this deception exceeded anything in my previous experience." As dawn light streamed through the morning room windows, word arrived from the village constabulary regarding the prisoner's statements. Samuel Hartwell, his courage finally failing him entirely, had provided a complete confession detailing his role in the mechanical deception while maintaining he never intended actual murder. James Pemberton, alternating between professional pride and desperate remorse, described the acoustic apparatus with the cold precision of an engineer discussing valves and pressures, his technical vanity ultimately providing more evidence than legal pressure could have achieved. Mrs. Blackwood spoke quietly of debts and promises, of a widow's fear and a benefactor's persuasive arithmetic, her weathered face bearing the weight of accumulated grief and manufactured complicity. Of Miss Vale herself, there could be no doubt regarding her culpability. She met every question with a composure that only hardened as her house yielded its evidence, until even her silence seemed an admission skillfully phrased. Holmes began his systematic exposition with that clear, unemotional precision I had so often admired. The first indication of sophisticated planning was the acoustic apparatus itself, he explained to Lestrade and Dr. Whitmore. A dismissed stable-hand's malice could not conceive resonance chambers and frequency-selective compounds. The glycerin and pine tar betrayed a railway engineer's expertise, while the bicycle's cautious approach confirmed technical collaboration. He indicated the recovered correspondence with clinical detachment. When the threatening note appeared on Pemberton Mill's paper, the connection became clear. However, the recurrence of that watermark in Miss Vale's personal correspondence, coupled with handwriting that matched entries in the parish relief fund records, transformed suspicion into certainty. The financial motive, Holmes demonstrated, revealed itself through careful analysis of Miss Vale's circumstances. Her fortune, founded upon agricultural rents and mercantile investments, had suffered severely under falling yields and unwise speculation. Her charitable obligations, once a source of local pride, had become a hemorrhage. She lacked either the courage to curtail openly or the integrity to sustain honourably. She studied the parish ledgers with remarkable thoroughness, Holmes continued, identifying those whose elimination would most effectively reduce her financial burden while concealing existing irregularities. The Raven's supernatural pronouncements created psychological pressure, while fear and circumstance accomplished the actual eliminations. Mrs. Ashford, with her weak heart, succumbed to nocturnal terror. Thomas Blackwood's dangerous working conditions provided the perfect opportunity for apparently accidental death following prophetic warning. The tragic case of Sarah Pemberton, Holmes explained, represented an unplanned complication that ultimately strengthened the conspiracy's hold over its participants. Her romantic attachment to Samuel Hartwell made her suspicious of his sudden secretiveness and apparent wealth. When she discovered correspondence regarding the mechanical apparatus and confronted her brother James with her knowledge, his panicked response near the river eliminated another witness while binding him more firmly to Miss Vale's cause through manufactured grief and complicity. By noon, the legal machinery had begun its inexorable process. Miss Vale was conveyed to the county jail on charges of conspiracy and murder by procurement, her charitable reputation forever destroyed by the revelation of calculated cruelty. Mrs. Blackwood faced charges as an accessory before and after the fact, though Holmes recommended mercy given her manipulation by more sophisticated minds. James Pemberton confronted an extensive catalogue of charges including conspiracy, manslaughter in his sister's death, and criminal mischief. Samuel Hartwell, whose confession provided crucial evidence, would face justice tempered by his cooperation with authorities. Mrs. Hartwell, the unwitting instrument of attempted poisoning, was released to the vicar's care with Holmes's strong recommendation for clemency. The prussic acid bottle, he noted with grim satisfaction, bore a chemist's label traced directly to Miss Vale's personal account, providing final proof of the conspiracy's reach into every aspect of the household's operation. That evening, as we returned to the familiar comfort of Baker Street, Holmes settled into his armchair, with the glazed clay shard balanced thoughtfully upon his long fingers. The compound, he observed, represented a sophisticated mixture of shellac, graphite, and metallic dust, applied with the understanding that terror could be tuned like a violin string to achieve precise psychological effects. The ravens outside our window croaked in their natural, homely fashion, their innocent voices a stark contrast to the supernatural chorus that had terrorized the Surrey countryside. Holmes smiled faintly at the sound, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight with characteristic analytical satisfaction. "Ravens speak only what men teach them, Watson," he said quietly, his voice carrying that philosophical note that marked the conclusion of our most complex cases. Superstition is merely the echo chamber of fraud, amplifying human weakness until it becomes indistinguishable from genuine mystery. I ventured that justice, though arriving through circuitous means, had ultimately proven thorough in its application. Holmes shook his head with familiar austerity, his keen mind already moving beyond the immediate satisfaction of solved crime toward broader considerations of human nature. "Justice stumbles when pride plays usher," he replied thoughtfully. Miss Vale preferred reputation to duty, economy to candour. It is a common malady among those who mistake appearance for substance, though rarely executed with such operatic elaboration. He reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings to produce a single, clear note that hung in the evening air like crystalline truth cutting through deception's fog. The sound seemed to cleanse the atmosphere of our sitting room, replacing the memory of supernatural voices with honest, musical expression. "Come, my dear fellow," Holmes said, his characteristic energy returning, as he prepared to lose himself in musical contemplation. "We have had quite enough of false voices for one investigation. Let us incline our ears to honest sound until the next summons from Scotland Yard replaces harmony with the inevitable necessity of human justice." The case of the speaking ravens had reached its conclusion, supernatural terror yielding once again to the inexorable application of scientific method and logical deduction, though the human capacity for elaborate deception had provided fresh evidence of ingenuity applied to deplorable purposes. 3 weeks had passed since the arrest of Miss Vale and her accomplices when Dr. Whitmore paid us a final visit at Baker Street, his countenance bearing the restored composure of a man who had weathered both supernatural terror and calculated murder with his sanity intact. The November fog had lifted from London as well as from his Surrey estate, and he brought with him news of the conspiracy's complete unravelling under the weight of accumulated evidence. Holmes received our former client with characteristic courtesy, though I observed his grey eyes studying the doctor's features with that analytical attention that never entirely ceased, even when a case had reached its official conclusion. The Morning Post had already brought word from Inspector Lestrade regarding the prisoners' final dispositions, each receiving justice proportionate to their culpability in the elaborate scheme. Miss Vale maintains her composure even in confinement, Dr. Whitmore reported, settling into the chair he had occupied during that first terrifying visit. The magistrate sentenced her to 20 years transportation to the colonies, though her demeanour remained unnaturally calm throughout the proceedings. The evidence against her proved overwhelming, yet she showed no trace of remorse. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that familiar gesture of contemplation. Justice operates according to legal precedent rather than moral satisfaction, Doctor. Miss Vale's sentence reflects the difficulty of proving direct causation between her instructions and the actual deaths, though her conspiracy charges ensure she will trouble no more charitable recipients. The fates of the other conspirators had been settled with similar precision. James Pemberton received 15 years hard labour, his engineering expertise earning him assignment to colonial railway construction, where his technical skills might serve more constructive purposes. Samuel Hartwell, whose cooperation had proved crucial to the prosecution's case, faced 7 years imprisonment with the possibility of early release contingent upon continued good behaviour. Mrs. Blackwood, the tragic widow whose grief had made her vulnerable to Miss Vale's manipulation, received the mercy Holmes had recommended, 2 years in Millbank Prison with provision for early release to the custody of her sister in Yorkshire. The mechanical apparatus has been thoroughly documented by Scotland Yard's technical division, Dr. Whitmore continued, producing a leather portfolio containing detailed drawings of the acoustic system. Inspector Lestrade requested that I convey their admiration for your deductive methods, particularly your recognition that supernatural effects invariably conceal mechanical causes. Holmes examined the technical drawings with evident interest, noting the precision with which Pemberton had calculated resonance chambers and frequency modulation. The engineer's pride in his work had ultimately provided the most damning evidence against the conspiracy, his detailed explanations revealing not merely the method, but the systematic planning that had made the deception possible. The restoration of normal life to the Surrey countryside had proceeded with remarkable speed once the supernatural terror was exposed as elaborate fraud. Dr. Whitmore had established a new charitable arrangement, distributing Miss Vale's confiscated assets among the genuine poor of the parish under ecclesiastical oversight. The irony was not lost upon him that her wealth, accumulated through systematic elimination of charitable recipients, would now serve those very purposes she had sought to escape through murder. The vicar has requested a small memorial service for the victims, Dr. Whitmore said quietly. Mrs. Ashford, Thomas Blackwood, and poor Sarah Pemberton deserve recognition that their deaths, while serving evil purposes, were not meaningless. Holmes considered this request with uncharacteristic solemnity, his analytical mind perhaps contemplating the human cost of intellectual puzzles solved through deductive reasoning. Their memorial lies in the exposure of the conspiracy that claimed their lives, Doctor. Truth serves the dead more faithfully than ceremony, though I understand the comfort such observances provide to the living. As our visitor prepared to depart, Holmes moved to the window overlooking Baker Street, his silhouette dark against the pale winter light. The fog had lifted completely, revealing the familiar bustle of London life proceeding with customary energy, unmarked by the supernatural terrors that had briefly disturbed the Surrey countryside. After Dr. Whitmore's departure, Holmes remained contemplative, eventually reaching for his violin with that familiar gesture that marked the conclusion of our most complex investigations, as he drew the bow across the strings, producing those clear, honest notes that had become his preferred method of reflection. The music filled our sitting room with mathematical precision. "Another case concluded, Watson," he said finally, his voice carrying that note of philosophical reflection that marked the end of our most intricate puzzles. The supernatural will always find ready believers, but systematic investigation reveals the human hand behind even the most elaborate deceptions. The ravens spoke only what men taught them, yet their false voices nearly claimed additional victims before truth could silence them. The case of the speaking ravens had demonstrated once again that the most perplexing mysteries yield to methodical analysis, though the human capacity for calculated cruelty disguised as virtue remained a sobering reminder of the stakes involved in our peculiar profession.